in the chat box by writing your name, your school, the state you're in, and email address. And also make sure to fill out our pre-event survey, which should take no longer than a minute. So with that said, let me introduce myself. I am Tahe Joya Jun, and I am currently pursuing my doctoral studies at Cornell. I was also a KASF scholarship recipient last year, and I believe the survey link has just been added onto the chat box. So if you guys could just take a minute to fill that out, that would be great. All right, so we're here today so that we can understand and hopefully learn ways to create or improve our resumes and our CVs and cover letters as well. We recognize that students aren't able to make use of career centers or advisors in a typical fashion right now. And so we hope that we can address your concerns even in the slightest way today. First, let me introduce the woman behind organizing this event for us, our Executive Director of KASF, Dr. Eunjung Lee. Dr. Lee, if you could say a couple of words for us before we begin our session.
Thank you, Dahe. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our event today. We have 3 sessions from today for resume cover letter writings, networking, and financial management. This year is very unusual due to COVID-19. Our virtual educational events were designed to support your summertime to be meaningful because we understand most of you are staying at home. I hope you can take this opportunity to make sure you are ready for your future career. I received many questions when you will hear from us about the scholarship award. Our volunteers are working very hard to evaluate applications now. We have 20% more applications than last year. Our timeline is to announce the final awardee list in late August. Thank you all, and please enjoy our first virtual educational session today. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Lee. Before we proceed, if you have the gallery view on and it's just too many faces for you, please make use of the speaker view. It should just be a little easier on the eyes for you guys. Our event will consist of a presentation, and then we will have a Q&A session at the end. So if you have any questions, please feel free to send them in the chat box, and we'll try to address them during the Q&A. Again, a last reminder, if you haven't, please introduce yourself in the chat box and fill out that pre-event survey. Dr. Lee has sent them multiple times in the chat box now. Your mics will also be muted throughout the event, so if you want to comment or have a question, please send it to us in the group chat. So finally, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the evening, Heidi Yu. Heidi is the Assistant Director for Letters and Science on the counseling team at the UC Berkeley Career Center. Prior to UC Berkeley, Heidi has provided career and academic support for students at various other institutions. Heidi has, well, prior to working in higher education, she worked in the nonprofit space, assisting many different communities. And she is joining us today from the Bay Area. And so now I will toss this over to her.
Hey, thank you, Dahe. Thank you, Dr. Lee. It's such a pleasure to be able to be a resource during this time. I'm meeting with a lot of students who feel a sense of, anxiety about their future. And so being able to support you during this time and provide resources is really something that I'm really happy to do. And today we're going to be talking about writing effective resumes and cover letters. And I think this is a question that comes up time and again with students. And so to just get us started, I just want to ask a question, and you can pop it into the chat. How long do you think it takes for a recruiter to review one resume, just for the initial scan? Okay, 30 seconds, 25 seconds, 8 seconds. So you're really in a good ballpark. So it's 5 to 15 seconds for that initial scan. So with that in mind, it's really important that you get right to the point and you use very impactful language that employers can catch right away. Sometimes when I meet with students, they tell me, oh, I think an employer should assume or should infer that I have these skills or qualifications. But when employers, especially through applicant tracking systems, where it's become so easy to apply for opportunities, they're getting a huge stack, especially for their larger companies like Google. So that means you have to stick out, you have to stand out. And so you have to be really intentional about the language and the information that you include on your documents. So really, I think one of the things that you have to think about is the idea of the resume and really what is its purpose. Essentially, it's a marketing tool where you can tell your story, show your interests, skills, experiences, and you want to make sure you include that information on your resume and your cover letter because it's what gets you to the interview. Sometimes when I meet with students, they'll say, oh, I'm going to save that for my interview. But if the employers are not intrigued enough in that short period of time, unfortunately, that interview may not happen. And lastly, this can also be a really valuable tool where you can network and connect with employers, with alumni. Now, the thing is, one of the first things that you want to do when you approach applying for jobs is to really read the job descriptions carefully. You want to analyze what the employer is asking for. Take a look at the duties. What have you done that's very similar to what they're asking for? And I know a lot of times students will say, I've never done that before. But if you really look at the essence of what the employer is asking for, let's say it's presenting to clients. Well, I'm sure as student leaders, you've presented to other students or you've presented to colleagues and staff. So think about where you can draw those connections between what the employer is asking for and what you'll be doing day to day and what you've done. And also skills. What are the skills that employers are looking for and they're specifying? Especially if they're mentioning those skills multiple times throughout the job description, they're going to be looking for those skills. And another thing is, when you look at that required qualifications section, if those qualifications tend to be towards the top of the list, the employers are probably going to really want that. So make sure if you have those skills, make that apparent on your resume and cover letter. Now, sometimes students tell me, like, I'm really scared. I don't meet all of the qualifications. Should I even bother applying? If you meet about 70% of what the employer is asking for, then certainly go ahead and go for it, especially if you can make some connections between your academic coursework, your leadership roles, your volunteer roles, and connecting it to what the employer wants. Now, one of the things that you want to do is you have to start identifying your strengths. According to the National Association of Colleges and Employers, when they survey employers every year, and these are among the top 10 or 11 strengths. And often they might shift in order, but these have been consistent over time. So you'll notice that a lot of these strengths are not necessarily knowledge of Python or coding, which, yes, for certain positions that's key, but it's a lot of the soft skills like problem solving, leadership skills, communication skills. And these are skills that you're developing all the time through your coursework and all the different activities that you're taking part of. So you really want to think about, where have I used these skills, and and start thinking of examples of where you use these skills, because that can be peppered throughout your resume and cover letter, as well as be incorporated in your interview. One of the pitfalls that students fall into is that they talk about their job in terms of what were the tasks that they did at that job. So an example is, I helped a student who was working at Starbucks, but she wasn't interested in, food management. She was interested in human resources. So we talked about what were some of these transferable skills that we see here that a lot of different employers want that she could demonstrate through her Starbucks role. So we talked about her communicating with customers, the problem-solving skills, resolving conflict and issues with orders. She also showed leadership by training new staff, right? So you want to frame what you did, less about, oh, I filed these papers, I made coffee, and more about what are the transferable skills that we can pull from that experience that can be utilized in a lot of different environments. Now we're going into the sections of the resume, and these are just some of the range of the sections that you can incorporate. They're, of course, not all required. Often what is consistent across a number of different resumes, you'll see education, experience, and skills. Beyond that, the other sections, and they can certainly be many more, that can be ways for you to showcase your skills much more clearly and to enhance your resume. So really you want to think about where can you pull from different parts of your background to show holistically what you can offer to employers. So we're going to break things down by different sections. When we look at, so we're going to start with contact information. So we see here Jane, she wants to go by JC. So I know some students are like, well, I have this, Korean name, but I really want to go by, Julia. So in which case you may want to include the name that you prefer to be contacted or called in parentheses. A lot of students will include their full address on their resume. That is not necessary anymore, especially with these applicant tracking systems. You don't want your full address floating around out there. Phone number, email, and then LinkedIn. So LinkedIn is definitely, if you have a profile, great. If you don't, that could be a good project this summer because a lot of employers, especially the major companies, use LinkedIn as a way to find talent. Moving on to the education section. So this is just a sample of how you can write out your education section. So you have your current institution is listed first. And then you don't need to tell employers when you started. Instead, just tell them when you're going to finish because that's what they're most interested in. You can include your degrees, your minors. If you have a strong GPA, meaning anything above a 3, then definitely that can show employers very clearly that you're motivated, you're hardworking. So that can be used to help you. Coursework, that can be useful to show a knowledge in a certain area. So especially for students who may not have a lot of experience in their field, showing that you took a computer science course or a psychology course that might be relevant to the job or internship you want tells the employer you have foundational knowledge in that area. So I wouldn't include 20 courses, but certainly 4 to 6 courses that are most relevant and most important to the employer could be good to include. For those of you that studied abroad, you can indicate that information under your current institution. And in this case, you want to include the time frame where you did study abroad. And then lastly, if you attended community college or if you want to include high school, then you'll incorporate that information along with when you finish that degree. Okay. Now, we're going to jump into the resume bullet. And I think this is really important because a lot of times students don't really write effective bullet points where employers can see their skills clearly. And so this is my suggested formula that you can use. So when you create a bullet point, you want to start off each bullet point with an action word. And so in the slide, which you should be getting, you'll see a list of action words that are organized by skill type. And so when the employer looks at that action word, it gives them a clue. Okay, the student is sharing with me leadership skills or helping skills or communication skills. So you want to be intentional about using that action word because it's that action word that provides a clue as to which skill you're trying to show. Now, the action word creates the idea of what. So you see the what is created a program. Now we see these two versions here, right? Which one is stronger, version 1 or version 2 in your opinion? And you can pop that into the chat box. Right, version 2. And version 2 is stronger because it provides more information about the skill you're conveying. So you can do that by answering how or why or both. So in the second example, created a program why to educate community members on healthy and affordable nutrition options. How? Using video and in-person workshops. If you can add to the mix your impact in the form of numbers, especially for business, business employers love numbers. So if you can incorporate that, that shows your impact, right? The how shows your skills in more detail. So if you say, I know Python, or I know how to present in public, you're proving the skills with the how. The why shows your rationale, your critical thinking behind your actions. So I encourage you, definitely as you're approaching the bullet point, try to use this formula so you have a more impactful bullet point. Now, if we go into the experience section, so if we're just taking a look, we have the job title, the dates, the organization, and city state. So this format is not something that you have to use. This is just one version. But one thing I will say is just be intentional about what you bold. Sometimes students will bold the job title and the employer title all together. When you have a lot of bolded information together, nothing really sticks out. So if you're like, I really want the employers to see that I've been a leader in all of these areas, you may want to bold your job title. And that way they see very quickly your leadership roles. If you're like, well, I want them to see I worked in major organizations, then you may want to bold the organization name. And you'll see these bullet points. For one experience, you probably don't want more than 6 bullet points. Now, students will say, should I have the same number of bullet points for each job? No. You want to think about what is most relevant to the jobs that you want. So certain roles might only be 2 bullet points. Certain roles that are very relevant for the jobs that you want might be 6 bullet points. So you can be thoughtful and strategic about that. One of the things I will also say is be intentional as well in terms of how you order your bullet points, because sometimes employers may not read all of those bullet points. So they might look at the first one and then the last one, right? So things in the middle might get lost. So if you're really proud of certain things that you've done or skills that you really want to showcase, just make sure that is probably one of the first bullet points that you add or one of the last ones so that employers will take a look. Now, I want to talk about projects. So a lot of times students will say, I don't have a lot of experience in my field, so I feel really embarrassed about this. What can I show? So many times students forget to leverage their actual coursework, the hard work that they put in major senior thesis, master's thesis, or even a personal project. I have students that are working on amazing side projects on their own, passion projects, and you can certainly leverage that on your resume, especially at this time when some students, they had their offers rescinded by employers. They have gotten scrappy and have created their own side projects to demonstrate skills and develop skills. So here's an example of a public health paper and project that a student is leveraging on their resume. So you can certainly do that. And this is very useful to bridge that gap between what you're learning and to show employers that you can apply your learning in real world settings. Now, I want to talk about, and these are just a snapshot of specific experience sections. Oftentimes I see students who put all of their experience in one section, and what that does is it creates a cloudy picture of your experiences. Sometimes it's helpful to include very clear section headings to tell the employer what you're going to discuss in that section. So let's say you're applying for a research role. It might make sense to create a research experience section where all of your where all of your research experiences, whether paid or unpaid, is focused and together. For some students who want to show, like, I'm a leader, they might want to put all of their leadership experience all in one section. And other examples that I've seen, I had a student who she had different marketing experiences through her student leadership roles, her personal projects. So she tied that all together under a general brand of marketing experience so that employers could see a more focused view of her marketing background instead of being peppered throughout her resume. So I encourage you to do that. You don't have to organize your experience, because sometimes students will say, I saw this template, so I put all of my work experience, all of my volunteer experience, and sometimes the volunteer experiences are really strong. It's just that they weren't paid. So you can certainly move relevant experience, even if it's not paid up, if it's helpful. Skills. So going back to what I said in the beginning, so just look at what the employer is asking for, and especially if they repeated skills throughout the job description, and if they listed skills towards the top of the list, definitely make sure those skills are very clear. And in this case, when a student wants to showcase a lot of skills, it may help to include categories such as technical skills, spoken languages, so that it's just easy for the employer to scan. Remember, if the employer is only spending 5 to 15 seconds, you want to make readability easy so that they can pick up on all those great skills that you're bringing to the table. Now, another strategy, so you don't have to put your skills at the bottom. Sometimes if you have really strong skills for what the employer wants and you're like, wow, I met almost all that they're asking for and I want to make sure they see that, you may even want to consider putting your skills towards the top. And I know in meeting with some of the computer science students or engineering students that I've met with, that might be the case where they can show their programming languages right away, right? So that could be a strategy for you as well. All right, so I'm going to kick it over to Dahe, who's going to talk about resumes versus CVs.
Okay, so the CV is different from a resume in many ways, most notably due to its length. The resume, as Heidi has explained, is a concise way of presenting your qualifications and skills for a specific position. A CV, on the other hand, presents a full history of your academic credentials. So the length of CVs will most often depend on years of experience. And so even if it's only 1 to 2 pages because you're just beginning your professional career, that's completely fine. They are generally used for fellowships, grants, postdoc positions, teaching and research positions, and even grad school applications, which I believe many of you would be most interested in at the moment. But a CV for grad school entry will often resemble a resume, and this is just because you won't have much experience in the field, and that's fine because most programs, they all recognize this. They know that you're not going to have an extensive list on your CV. A CV will just emphasize different things from a resume. So maybe instead of emphasizing previous part-time jobs, you want to emphasize your academic accomplishments. But like Heidi said, it really is about relevance to the position that you're applying to. And those are just a couple of points, but I will get a bit more detailed when we go over some of the samples.
Right, thanks, Dahe. Okay, so just some general guidelines to consider when you're thinking about your resume. Yeah, definitely what Dahe has said, relevance, right? Think about what is relevant, what is most important for employers to see. And I know a lot of times students will say, well, I've done so much. Really, should my resume be just a page? For most cases, yes, right? They just want to see the best and most relevant experience. In certain industries like education or academia, you can go on for longer. And that's why, and Dahe will talk about the CV, where it's much more expansive. But really for most fields, 1 page should be sufficient to cover the best and most relevant experience. Sometimes students will ask about templates. Templates can be useful to input information. Unfortunately, time and time again, when you're trying to do major edits, templates can be a pain. Just because when you're moving major things around, it might impact the formatting. And so in my book, I think it's much easier, even though initially it means more work to type out your resume. When you're trying to make major edits, it's going to be better in the long run. One of the things, you'll see this snazzy sample on the side. So sometimes students will say, I'm really bored with the versions that you sent me. I want something more interesting. And for certain fields, it makes sense to have something much more colorful and creative. So you want to be mindful of industry. Keep in mind, though, that applicant tracking systems may have a difficult time picking up on these images or columns. So if you're really adamant and wanting to use this kind of sample, just make sure that you use that maybe for networking, or if you're emailing it directly to someone. But if you're submitting online through an applicant tracking system, which a lot of the bigger companies and universities use, I would use the straightforward version, just because it's easy to scan and easy to read. With font and style, you know, be creative just as long as it's not distracting and as long as you're being consistent. Sometimes students want to get artistic and they're using 4 different font styles. What happens is that it takes away from your resume and actually sometimes makes it look less polished. So just keep that in mind. Consistency, simplicity is probably the safest way to go when conveying your experiences and skills on a resume. Additional guidelines, a lot of times students will include references on the resume. So that actually belongs on a separate document, and you can use the same header as your resume, but that belongs on a separate page. And just keep in mind, you want to have 3 professional references. So if that's not something you have, that's definitely something you want to use this summer to develop or reconnect with people who can be your references. Be honest. So you want to make sure that you're not overselling your skills. A lot of the issues that I see is that students undersell their skills, but you don't want to oversell, just because a lot of interviewing processes, especially when it's more technical in nature, include some sort of assessment or a test. So definitely make sure that it, you know, just be honest in terms of what you can bring. And when you save your document, unless the employer says that they have a preference for a Word document, generally saving as a PDF so that your formatting can be saved, and then save your document with your names. A lot of times students will send documents that say resume, but if you do that, employers won't know who you are. So include your name in the document title, and then get feedback. You're going to amazing institutions, go to your career services so you have extra pairs of eyes to review. But as well, go to alumni who might be working in industries or places that you're interested in so that you can get industry-specific feedback. When I decided to move to the Bay Area, I reached out to an alum who graduated from Barnard, like me, and I bothered her to review my resume, and she ripped apart my resume. And that was so useful because I got a perspective that I wanted for a place that I wanted to work for. So definitely get feedback, so that way you're sending out the best version of your documents possible. Okay, so we're just gonna look at a couple of samples. This is a first-year sample, and in this case, you'll see that the student has included a paper. There are also some jobs as well as leadership experiences. So I know a lot of high school students have amazing student leadership or committees that they're a part of. So don't feel that just because you weren't paid or that it's not in a professional organization that it doesn't count. It can certainly count to show employers that you have relevant experience and skills. Here's an example of a more seasoned student who transferred. And so here you'll see what I mentioned earlier about an experience section and a leadership section. In this example, you'll see an interest. If you have the room for it, you can include interests, of course, especially if it's relevant. So when I used to work in Portland, Nike was not too far away. And so a lot of students wanted to apply for Nike. What was really important was when I was talking to students is that they showed sports on their resume, because that showed an alignment between what Nike did and an interest in sports. So if it's relevant, include it. But if you include interests, just make sure you're not saying baking, hiking, riding, you know, which is so generic. If you can say something more specific, like one student, she came in 3rd place in her local baking competition, and that was very memorable versus baking. Okay, all right. I'll send it over to Daher, who will talk about the CV.
So thank you, Heidi. This is a sample CV, which shows us that it should always begin with the education section. And if you have a dissertation, include the title, the resume name, or the committee members, which is shown here in the sample. And if you want, you can also include like a quick summary about what your dissertation is, just because most of the times the title doesn't give too much. You could also do this for any research projects you may have had during undergrad. So if you had an individual project in a lab or an honors thesis, you want to include that. So notice how this person decided to emphasize their teaching and advising first by making it their second section. This should be done if you are applying for a teaching position, right? But if it is a position that is much more research-based, you want to make the research experience portion come first. So for grad school applications, you should research about the program and try to figure out to the best of your ability if they are heavily research focused group. And I know that can be very difficult if you're just looking on their websites, but something that I found helpful is reaching out to the actual current members of the labs that you're interested in, or people who are currently part of the program. And so if you can, try to pinpoint what your potential advisor is looking for. If you find out that they're looking for a grad student who possesses a specific skill, or more often than not, a specific research interest, try to emphasize that as well in your CV. So CVs will also include publications, presentations, honors, and awards, which include fellowships and so on. But also it could include things like small awards or small scholarships that you received during college or any other time. But again, the order is really dependent on what you are applying for and what stage you are in your career. So you might not have a publication, you might not have a presentation, and that's fine. So for the sake of time, that's all I'm going to say about the CV. But if you have any questions, feel free to send them in the chat box and we can discuss them during the Q&A at the end, or you can even email me.
All right, thanks, Dahe. So we're gonna move on to the cover letter, and this is something where students are like, okay, I kind of get the resume, I have no idea what the cover letter is about, or I don't know what the purpose is. So I think that's the issue. And I think once you understand what the purpose of the cover letter is, hopefully it'll be easier to write the cover letter. So as you saw with the resume, it is a lot about what you know and what you can do, and you can show a little bit of your personality through your involvement in different things or your interests. But the cover letter is really your opportunity to express passion and enthusiasm and interest in what the organization does and in that position, where you don't really get that opportunity on your resume so much. And then it allows you to provide a spotlight on key parts of your background that show skills that the employers are looking for. And then lastly, and then it shows your writing ability. So a lot of times students will say, they didn't ask for a cover letter, should I submit one? Yes, you always want to submit one for the reasons I discussed, but also because they want to see how you communicate in writing. And then lastly, even though the cover letter has this structure, which we'll talk about, you want to make sure that it's tailored for every position. And that's the same thing with the resume. And I mentioned this to Dahe and Eunjung Sensengim, that I spoke to the National University recruiter for Kaiser, and he thought it was really funny that he could just see a mile away which student sent the same resume to multiple places because it's so generic that they didn't take time to customize, and he saw it right away. So just make sure you customize because employers do notice. So just some general tips that are similar to the resume: know the employer, analyze the job description, connect highlights from your background. So you don't want to repeat the whole resume, but really focus on the most important parts of your background. And then focus on what you can bring to the employer. A lot of students will talk about what they want to gain. I want to get experience and you can give it to me. Yes, that's a benefit, but really the employer is more concerned with what can you bring with your unique blend of talents, interests, experiences, and skills. The first paragraph, so we're going to break it down section by section. The questions that you want to try to answer is why them? So if you have a story about them, great. If you don't, then do your research and pick out one or two things that resonate with you that you want to showcase, and tell them that this is what makes me so excited to apply for this position. Tell them what position, because if it's a large company, Like Apple, they're going to have multiple openings, so let them know what you're interested in. Introduce what you can bring to the table. And then if someone's referred you to an opportunity, you can mention this in the first paragraph so it's clear. So we're going to look at two versions. We have version 1 and version 2. So in the chat box, just indicate which version do you think is stronger. Okay, yes, version 2. And you're right. And a lot of times though, I see version 1, very generic. You know, it's obvious this student might have pulled out San Francisco Giants for something else, whereas the second version is something much more personal. We also get a sense of what they're applying for, and they introduce the skills that they're going to discuss in their letter, which is social media, communications, and leadership skills. Now, sometimes when students see this, they're like, well, I don't have that personal story. Then we circle back to your research. What did you research about the organization? And you can pick out 1 or 2 things that spoke to you that make you excited to work for that organization. And you can bring that up into paragraph 1. Now, when we go into the body paragraphs, one of the things I just want to say is don't just say what skills you have. Many students do that. Oh, I have good social media skills and I'm a great communicator and I'm hardworking. When you do that, unfortunately, it becomes so generic that it becomes less memorable. So instead, you want to show them the skills by utilizing concrete examples. So we're going to look at a version here. So in this case, we have a student who wants to discuss research and analytical skills in a body paragraph. So what can be helpful in structuring the example is the context, action, result method. So here we have the context. The context is the student is working on a group project where they're collecting and analyzing data on college students. So that's the context. Then we have the actions that actually show the research and analytical skills. So they developed a survey, they analyze results on SPSS. What you want to add to that to really bring home impact is what was the positive result of your actions. So here we see, as a result, we were encouraged to share our report with the Dean of Students. There we have a positive result of your impact. This student goes on to add another car story about her internship. You don't have to do that. You don't have to add more than 1 story, but if you want to and it's short, you can certainly add that if you wish. So here, we have very clearly the student is spelling out and demonstrating the research and analytical skills. Now with the final paragraph, this is an opportunity for you to re-emphasize why you're a good fit. You want to tell them that you have a passion and interest related to what they want to do. Tell them you want to interview, and then you want to thank them for being considered. I think it'll be clearer when we look at some samples. So just looking at the format, when we look at the format at the top, you will see your contact information or the student's contact information. If you want to use the same header as your resume, that's certainly fine. And that does help to create a consistent look to your documents. Then the date, then you have the contact information of the employer. Often this is not information that is included in the job description. So you have to do some investigative work. Who's the head of that department? Who's the head of HR? Sometimes for nonprofits, it's just easier to indicate the executive director. And what this does is it tells the reader that you did your research. So students will say, well, what if that's not the right person? Ultimately, it doesn't matter because again, you took time out to find out who they are. And then we have the first paragraph where we see the interest in Pixar, we see enthusiasm for the work, and then, it references what they're going to talk about, which is their knowledge of staff development. The middle paragraph, we see an example of their experience, and to close, they're re-emphasizing their passion for this work and what they can bring to the table, right? So, and then they end with thank you. This other sample, it looks a little different, but the concept is the same. It's just that the skills are on the left-hand side and you have the car stories, the examples on the right. So some students like this because it gets straight to the point. You might see this with very business-like or sales-like resumes that, you know, or maybe tech resumes where you just got to get right to the point. So this could be really good for that. The other version might be better where, you know, maybe education or something that really wants to see your writing skills or policy experiences. So this version might be a better fit. So both versions are valid. It's just about, you want to think about who's going to be the reader and what can showcase your skills better, which version can show your skills better. Just some tips is definitely proofread. Keep in mind that you want to make sure that the style of your resume and cover letter are consistent. A lot of times students will use Times New Roman for one and then Arial or Calibri for the other, and it's a little confusing. So use consistent styling, and then make sure, similar to the resume, you add your name to the document title. All right, so that concludes the presentations. I guess we can open it up to questions for Dahe and I to answer some of the questions that either came up in the chat box, or if you want to unmute yourself, we can certainly answer questions that way too.
All right, thank you, Heidi, for that wonderful presentation. We'll begin our Q&A session now. And so I will begin with some of the questions that we received. Can you include experience from a long time ago, and how are we defining a long time ago?
That's a really good question. So general rule of thumb is probably not more than 10 years, right? So that's the general rule. However, sometimes you might have very relevant experience that brings up really good skills, in which case you can probably incorporate that experience, but you want that to complement what you're currently doing. So you don't want to rely solely on experiences that happened a long time ago. So short answer, generally 10 years. However, if you have very relevant experience from, you know, beyond that point that you really feel could be helpful to show employers that you have those skills, you can certainly pull them, but just be mindful and thoughtful of how those skills can complement what you're currently doing.
So another question we received is research experience necessary, highly valued regardless of the field? How can students start getting into research as an undergrad?
So that's a really good question. I think it will vary depending on the field. So if you are planning to become an academic or a professor, and I think Dahe can speak more to that side of things, I think it can be a strength. However, if you're interested in work related to law or policy, where there is a lot of research involved, then certainly research skills can be an asset. Now, I think certain institutions will have research programs. I know at UC Berkeley, we have the undergraduate research apprentice program, and I know they're not the only one, so you may want to just check with your advisor to see if they're comparable programs. If there aren't, I know the scrappier students will approach their department or professors to see if they know of anyone who might be looking for research assistance. Dahe, do you have any more to add to that?
Right, so for the second part of the question on how students could get started in research, I mean, personally, what I did during undergrad is that I just sent out a lot of emails to professors that I was interested in working in their lab. So usually they will have like their department website and you can read about what their research is. And so you want to include like you want to make it a short email because professors really generally won't have much time to go through paragraphs. And they might just not get to it. But if you just include a quick interest about what they're doing so that it's not, once again, a generic message that you're mass sending out to like 10 people, nice professors will most often respond to you, and sometimes they'll tell you, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not looking for any undergrads, but so-and-so might be, and so you can network that way. So our next question is, how would you go about formatting and detailing scholarships under honors and awards?
Sure. So I think having, of course, awards in its own section. Sometimes students will tuck it into education, which depending on how much space you have or how many other leadership roles or activities you want to include might be okay. But I think it's good to have scholarships, achievements in their own section so that they shine. So you would write the name of the scholarship, and then on the side when you were awarded, and then it's helpful for the reader to maybe have a bullet point, recognized for high academic achievement, or recognized for top, most service in the department. So giving the employer an indication of the achievement and what it means.
Right. So our next question is, should you have the most important relevant experience on the top within a main section, or should they be listed in chronological order?
So that's a good question. So both. Within one particular section, especially if it's very relevant for the job you want, you certainly want to have that at the top. So in that example earlier that I gave of marketing experience, so within that section, it's going to be in reverse chronological order, where the most recent experience, whether paid or unpaid, will be listed. So the most recent first, and then you go backwards in time. Once you have another section, so let's say you had marketing experience, an additional experience in that other section, then it starts all over again, where the most recent experience in that section is first, and then you go backwards in time.
Something, if I can just add to this, is that what I did, especially with my research experience, is that I found one research experience to be much more important than the other. And so I found a way to kind of make two sections out of it. And so I can just take that most important research experience out and make it first. So it's a first section and then continue to that. So another question is, should experiences be divided by academic and non-academic work related?
It doesn't have to. For some students, it makes sense. However, if I know for certain computer science students that I've met, they might actually combine, especially if they don't have a lot of experience, some of their academic projects with some smaller internships that they've done to have a more focused, like, computer science and programming section, then that's certainly fine. But if you feel like, look, I really want them to see that I did that coursework and that's one section, but I want them to see that I worked at Google and I want that to stand out, then it might make more sense to separate it.
So the next question is, what other consequences of writing an experience that was mentioned in the resume for your cover letter? Do you think it is too repetitive?
I don't think so. Sometimes, so in the resume, it might only be one bullet point that where you can really cover a certain skill, but in the cover letter, you can expand upon that and give more of a story and more actions around that one bullet point that you didn't have space for in your resume. So if it's really important, let's say that leadership role, you're president of a student organization in high school, college or grad school or beyond, and you did a lot for that role, then of course it may make sense that you're going to include it on your resume with some bullet points about what you did, and maybe even expand upon it by providing that car story, a more expansive example on your cover letter.
Okay, and our next question is, what would be a nice balance between showing personality while remaining professional in a cover letter?
I think that's really a good question. So I think if you bring it back to, I think one of the things you want to think about is, so in your research about the company, and maybe if you, and I do recommend any effective job search process, and I know that's a separate topic, has to incorporate connecting and networking with alums and employers. So I think as you're starting to talk to people, get a pulse of what the culture is like. And so with that in mind, with that informed knowledge, I think that will help guide you in terms of what is appropriate for that culture and that organization and what is not. And I think that's why starting with why you're excited to work for that company, I think that can draw out your personality a bit more, but still at the same time show enthusiasm for what they do.
All right, so our next question is, should cover letters be 1 page long, or is the length irrelevant?
I would do 1 page. Employers are busy. So show that you can, and a recruiter said this, they want to know that you can communicate concisely and effectively, and even with that limit, how can you get your message across?
Right. And so our next question is, could you expand on what is meant by culture of the company?
Sure, I think that's a good question. So, for example, certain companies I know, like let's say, um, what is it? Like Cliff Bar, I think. You know, they might have groups where employees can hang out and you know do community service projects together. So if you've done a lot of community service projects and you know this about the company, it might make sense to showcase how much service. You know, I saw that on your site and through your social media feeds that your staff volunteer and get, you know, connected with the community. And I love that. As someone who's done a lot of community service, I want to work for a company that does this. This shows that you're a fit, right? So whatever they communicate about themselves, whatever their values are, if you have similar values or interests, showing that you have that you're aligned. And if you can do that through your letter, as well as some of your interests on your resume, that is an example of culture fit. Hopefully that helps.
So our next question is, what's the benefit of including your LinkedIn profile on your resume if all the same experience and activities are reflected in both?
That's a really good question. So, you know, with the resume, you're limited to one page. So the LinkedIn should not be a direct copy of your resume. The nice thing about LinkedIn is that on your LinkedIn profile, and I think you're going to go into that in another session, is that you have that about me section where you can talk about yourself, and that helps to humanize and add dimension to who you are. But when you're talking about experiences, you should not simply copy and paste. In your LinkedIn, you're going to add, you can upload papers that you're proud of, or presentations that you did, or links to blogs that you created. So it's definitely much more robust in terms of showing your work. And then with the bullet points, whereas the resume, I said 4 to 6 bullet points, if you're like, oh, I wanted to say more and I wanted to add my achievements and outcomes more clearly, then that's something you can certainly add to your LinkedIn. So you're not as limited by space as you are with the resume.
So as a rising freshman, most of my resume contains high school related experiences such as clubs and high school awards. How much of that should I retain moving forward?
So that's a really good question. It's going to really depend on what experiences you take full advantage of while you're in school. So I've met with freshmen who, first years who got really involved. Like, you know, they became, they had a campus job, and then they were part of student organizations where they joined a committee. And so their involvement through those different roles on campus, and some also volunteered. So all of those things, we had to evaluate what was worth keeping on and what was, you know, what needed to start phasing out because they had gotten involved with new things.
And what looks like our final question, if any of you guys have any more, keep sending them in, but is there a certain font size for the resume and cover letter? I heard that you could go down to size 8 or 9 to fit everything in. Is this true, or is this too small?
I would not go beyond 10. So ideally 10 to 12 for the general, you know, text. And then the exception is your name, which is going to be the biggest text on the page. Smaller than 10, it's really hard to read. So I wouldn't go smaller than 10.
Okay. So what seems like